Now, what they said about the status quo is that the status quo is where a worker has a disagreement over his or her employee status. They can take their case to the High Court and seek a legal definition. But this was not the status quo with the Denny case. I mean, the clue is in the name. It was Henry Denny and Sons who took the case to the Supreme Court, not the employee. The state defended it the whole way. The state defended the scope decision the whole way. The Revenue Tax Commissioner's Tax Briefing Issue 43 is nothing more than a cover story. The real agenda of the Employment Status Group was to force employees to the High Court to seek a legal definition of their employment regardless of what evidence was presented to Scope or the Social Welfare Appeals Office. The Revenue Commissioner's representative at the Employment Status Group was the tax official who met with the courier companies in the Burlington Hotel. What is even more astonishing is that the social welfare representative at these meetings was the same person who prepared the Secretary General's reply to the PAC saying there were test cases, and who served as the Assistant Chief Appeals Officer until 2009. There can be no doubt that any claim that the Appeals Office is independent of the Department of Social Welfare is without foundation. When these high-level discussions about my sub judice case began, it had nothing to do with the hitherto unheard of Employment Status Group. It was originally a matter of concern for the Hidden Economy Group. It too wrote to the Office of the Inspectors of Taxes and to the Secretary of the Hidden Economy Group. It too wanted Revenue and Social Welfare to come into the Hidden Economy Group and explain what they were up to in classifying all couriers as self-employed. From the letter from ICTU to the Inspector of Taxes, Congress has been concerned. The number and scale of courier firms has expanded enormously. Serious allegations of tax evasion and non-compliance. They wanted Revenue and Social Welfare to come in there and explain what they were doing. It was the Hidden Economy Group. Nobody spoke about an Employment Status Group. That ICTU wanted a serious investigation into what was going on. They said there was a hidden economy, serious allegations, brief required. Revenue had known for at least a decade that courier companies were non-compliant with tax legislation and PRSI obligations. This was a serious threat to their secret tax deal. Then all of a sudden, in the Revenue Commissioner's Tax Briefing Issue 43, the proposed investigation of the courier sector by the Hidden Economy Group had metamorphosized into the Employment Status Group seeking a uniform definition of employee. It doesn't matter what case a worker makes the scope. The defined policy of the state in the Employment Status Group's secret agenda is to force a worker to the High Court to overturn a misclassification of self-employed. At the same time, non-compliant employers can misclassify workers as self-employed en masse in free secret courts like the Social Welfare Appeals Office, or over lunch in the Burlington Hotel, or whatever hotel with the Revenue Commissioners. Not only was my case discussed by the Employment Status Group, it was discussed in the context of overturning the decision. The Employment Status Group is a Machiavellian piece of fuckery on so many levels. Scope, pointless. Uniform definition of employee, not worth the paper it's written on it. None of it was ever going to make any difference. To hell or the High Court for deliberately misclassified workers is the legacy of the Employment Status Group. Now I went to the Social Welfare Appeals Office for the appeal. The Minister was represented by the Scope Office. He was also represented by Senior Counsel and a solicitor from the Chief State Solicitor's Office. The other side was represented by their array of legal eagles. And I had asked the CWU to provide me with legal representation. The evidence wasn't discussed. This appeal took 4 hours. The evidence was never discussed. All that was discussed was the interpretation of legal precedents. Now, the minister's legal representative said in their submission, it is noteworthy that in the Denny case, the contract between the parties was in writing and was drafted with considerable care with a view to ensuring that the punitive employee was regarded in law as an independent contract. Nevertheless, both the High Court and the Supreme Court affirmed the appeals office decision that the person was in fact an employee. Applying that law to the facts of this case, my case, it is contended that the appeals officer is bound to hold. That's the state's legal eagles, top legal eagles, telling the Social Welfare Appeals Office that they are bound to hold that I am an employee under a contract of service. Now, the decision didn't come out for 6 months afterwards, and the Social Welfare Appeals Office overturned the scope decision. In the meantime, I had appealed to the Employment Appeals Tribunal saying that I was constructively dismissed and that I wanted to have my case heard. When the Social Welfare Appeals Office decision came out, there was much fuss trying to stop this going ahead. But the Employment Appeals Tribunal is different to both scope and to Social Welfare Appeals Office. It is chaired by a senior counsel, and there is a panel that make the decisions. The Communications Workers Union had disappeared off the scene. They didn't help me in the least bit, but I was ready to go. I had put my case together, I was ready to go. The union had to go in and officially come off record. They were not going to represent me in here. They were not going to be associated with this case. Now, in the process of this, the report that had been used both by Scope and by the Social Welfare Appeals Office, the report from the Social Welfare Inspector, came up. And the other side said, you can't use it. And I said, why? It's evidence. And they said, the Social Welfare Inspector never spoke to our manager. And this was the manager of the company who were appealing the case. I wasn't allowed to use the report, but I noted it. So the evidence all along had been tainted by a falsified report. The EAT ruled, and the EAT ruled unanimously that I was an employee, and unanimously that I had been self-employed, or that I had been constructively dismissed. A really important aspect of their decision was that they pointed out the company was depending on a High Court case, McAuliffe versus the Minister for Social Welfare, which is the exact same precedent quoted by the Social Welfare Appeals Office in their decision. But a barrister, a senior counsel, and a panel said, no, you cannot ignore the Denny decision. The Denny decision applies here, not McAuliffe for the Minister for Social Welfare. Now, this was always going to be appealed, and this is important. I pointed out to you that the Social Welfare Appeals Officer is the equivalent of a circuit court judge. But the appeal of the Employment Appeals Tribunal goes only to the circuit court. Therefore, the jurisdiction of the Social Welfare Appeals Office is the higher decision. One, you have to appeal to the High Court. The other, you only appeal to the circuit court. So I knew I was on a hiding to nothing. I could not win this case, even though I had proved what had happened. I couldn't win this case. I set out with one purpose and one purpose only. I was going to get that social welfare inspector, I was going to put him on the stand, and I was going to take his evidence apart. I did. I called him in, and on the second day in the circuit court, I put him on the stand. I said, this report you wrote, and there was an objection from the company. They said, objection, and the judge said, I don't know what you're objecting about. I started again. I said, this report, the company objected. The judge asked him to explain. Company said the social welfare inspector had never met their manager. On the stand, that social welfare inspector had to admit that he never met the person in his report, never spoke to him, didn't take this evidence from him. But this was the circuit court, and it was a civil case, and I couldn't do any more than I had done. This man was not on trial. The other part of this is that since this agreement by the Employment Status Group, there has been no widespread investigations. Now, John Purcell, the former Comptroller and Auditor General, wrote to me, and he said, my office has been concerned about the issue, and we were talking about the Courier deal, and partly as a result of that concern, Revenue Commissioners in 1988 undertook a special program of 6,200 visits to principal contractors in the construction industry in 1 year. 6,000 principal contractors. During the visit, the status of 63,000 subcontract situations were examined, and 12,000 were reclassified as employees in a year, like that, 12,000. Because concerns were expressed at the Committee of Public Accounts last year that misclassification could still be rife, a similar campaign was commenced in the second half of the year, as you have noted in your letter. And yes, the Comptroller and Auditor General did the exact same thing, and 60,000 people, and found 1 in 5 to be misclassified. Now, also in this letter, Mr. Purcell gave the most honest account of why a secret tax and PRI exemption had been agreed between courier companies and revenue and social welfare. And he said, I wouldn't agree that contractors in the courier industry are exempt from taxation laws. What can be said is that the arrangement employed is administratively efficient in collecting tax from a sector